The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In a June 2015 Gallup poll, 38% of Americans said they would not support a Muslim candidate for president. Respondents ranked being Muslim as the third least desirable trait, only slightly more palatable than being an atheist or a socialist. Identity politics have long been a feature of our presidential campaigns, and current candidate rhetoric around Islam and its place in American society is not without historical precedent. Yet many have argued the unease some segments of the electorate have shown toward their Muslim neighbors reflects the unique confluence of trends of the 21st century in America. To help us understand the roots and impacts of Islamophobia in America, we're joined today by Wajahat Ali, host of Al Jazeera America's daily news program, The Stream. He's also author of The Domestic Crusaders, a play about post-9/11 Muslims in America. He served as lead author and researcher for the Center for American Progress report, Fear, Inc., Roots of Islamophobia Network in America, and he previously worked with the U.S. State Department to design and implement a leadership program to empower young social entrepreneurs. And he was given the honor of Generation Change Leader by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Wajahat Ali, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'd like to maybe start our conversation with a few snapshots from the campaign trail. We've got a few quotes here. We can go to the first one. This is Donald Trump, actually from a few years ago in an interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network. In response to the question, is there a Muslim problem in America? Absolutely, I didn't see Swedish people knocking down the World Trade Center. A little more recently, of course, Ben Carson's Meet the Press quote in which he said he would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of the nation. Absolutely would not agree with that. And Bobby Jindal, what these are unassimilated Muslims, are really trying to do is overturn our culture, and we need to recognize that. Well, this idea of culture being in jeopardy is not a new phenomenon. Here you see Norman Vincent Peale from 1960 saying, facing the election of a Catholic, our culture is at stake. Right. So what about that? What is there about, in our current election cycle, about Muslims that make them fair game for statements like this?
At least we're better than atheists and socialists. Right. That's very comforting. I mean, you can be at the bottom of the bottom. At leat we beat those darn bloody atheists and socialists.
Well, it's probably not good news for Bernie Sanders, but...
Those guys, we hate them. They're the worst. Look, what I always say is what's happening with Muslims in America right now is a remake. It's a cultural remake, and if you're a student of American history, and I'm glad you brought up that last quotation, the boogeyman in the past has been the Irish Catholic, has been the Jew, has been the LGBT member. Currently, it's still the African-American male, and also, I would say, Mexican immigrants. And of course, when it came to World War II, it was the Japanese threat, the yellow threat, if you will. And basically what happens is when you have ignorance mixed with fear, it's always a great political cocktail for candidates who want to prey on that misconception to get votes and money. So let's take Ben Carson, who may or may not have stabbed someone. You know, I love American politics, right? Like there's people clamoring to take credit for stabbing someone, almost stabbing someone, right? But Ben Carson, neurosurgeon who has interesting theories about Egyptian pyramids, allegedly storing grain, and as a neurosurgeon, may or may not have gone to West Point, who knows, because, facts, says he wants to preserve the integrity of this United States and preserve freedoms by not understanding the Constitution and implementing a religious a loyalty test for Muslims. When he says this, he's playing to his base. And when he said those comments on Meet the Press, he doubled down on those comments, and within a week, what happened is he got record number of fundraising. I think he got $1.1 million in 3 days. And he got great social media boost also. He took it to Facebook. He got thousands of new Facebook friends. So what we saw in 2012 is the same thing. It was the anti-Sharia threat, which according to attorneys, I was a licensed attorney back in the day, still am a licensed attorney, is about as useful as the anti-unicorn and anti-Bigfoot threat. But there's Americans who say, oh my God, this thing called Sharia, We have no idea what it means, but it's coming and taking over. 2004, if you remember, what was the threat? The gays are going to marry, and they're going to destroy America and family values. And this beautiful thing called traditional heterosexual marriage, which was all, peaches and cream, is all of a sudden going to be threatened. World War II, Japanese Americans. So it is a remake. And in this remake right now, when it comes to, I would say, the global antagonist and the global boogeyman, it is, quote unquote, the Muslim. But 60% of Americans, Doug, say that they don't know a Muslim, even though Muslims have been here since the 1500s. In fact, about 15 to 25% of the slave trade that was brought here forcibly against its will was Muslim. The two roots of Islamophobia, which I'll simply say is anti-Muslim bigotry, is the following: ignorance and misconceptions from the media. You marry those together, and I think most Americans who mean well, when they hear Muslim, they think an orc from Lord of the Rings that's going to come over and force their daughter to eat falafel and hummus, which I should say is a healthier alternative to cheese.
So, to what extent do you think this has morphed recently? I mean, some of the stereotypes from, say, 20 years ago were much more Arab-focused. I mean, we had the scary terrorist Arab, and now how did it morph from sort of ethnic Arabs to members of a certain faith?
No, that's an astute observation. 9/11 was critical. When the two towers fell, I think there was a permanent fork road in the international global timeline, right? That tragedy reverberated across the world, and it seared into the political and cultural consciousness, right? This language that emerged after 9/11, us versus them. The brown threat, I call it the brown Middle Eastern bouillabaisse threat, right? The people that Chuck Norris used to kill in the 80s, right? Libyans, Palestinians, whatever, Iron Eagle, down in Beverly Hills, an Iranian here and an Afghan there. It morphed into a civilizational conflict, which is why it's so frightening. All of that merged together into quote-unquote Islam, whatever Islam means. And Islam was versus the West, whatever West means. Who is the West? Who is Islam? I have no idea. I've never met either of them. And I'm 35 years old, born and raised in California, right? But it's this monolithic understanding of what the West is and what Islam is. And Islam as a religion, as a civilization that has existed for 1,400 years, as 1.5 billion people, also includes not just Muslims, but I always say those who look Muslimy. This includes Sikh Americans, Arab Christians, Persian Jews, dark-skinned guys who got a tan, mocha-colored folks. And, I joke about it, but look, the first hate crime that happened after 9/11 was where? In Arizona. Balbir Singh, a Sikh gas attendant who was shot and killed because they said he looks like one of them who brought down the towers. We're here in Wisconsin. What happened a couple of years ago? Sikh temple, a white supremacist. Most people think he went there because he thought they were the other. Shot and killed almost a dozen Sikh Americans. So it's really problematic, especially in the globalized world that we live in, where a story can change with a tweet or a YouTube upload, that the enemy is not just the Muslim, it's anyone who looks Muslimy, and it has transformed to this, like you said, this Middle Eastern caricature, who Chuck Norris used to kill, into something called Islam.
So, talk a little bit about that. I mean, the earlier sort of Arab stereotype was largely foreign policy based. I mean, there were like specific acts. I mean, think of characterizations of the PLO and the Palestinian terrorists.
Right.
Is there an analog to that? I mean, is there a real world basis for broadening that to Muslims as a whole?
No, you make a good point. Look, this actually goes all the way back to the Crusades. And I'll try to do a 1,000-year history in 2 minutes. But it's a marriage of politics to media and propaganda, right? So the foreign policy of the day actually dictates the villains of today, right? So when Pope Urban II in 1095 launched the Crusades to reclaim the Holy Lands from the Muslims, before that time, Muslims and Christians relatively had pretty good relations. Right around that time, 1095, right, you have a famous poem that came out called the Song of Roland, which is seen as a staple of Western literature to this day. It's a reimagining of a 9th century battle where apparently the Christians routed the Muslim army. But in reality, Charlemagne actually routed Christian Basques who were angry at him for the assault. But look at that, propaganda turned the enemy into the Muslims, right? You fast forward and you go to the Italian Renaissance. You got Dante. who wrote Divine Comedy. We still read it to this day. I'm an English major. He takes you through heaven, purgatory, and hell. In hell, who does he find being tortured and mutilated? Prophet Muhammad and the fourth Caliph Ali, right? You fast forward and you got the enlightened thinkers. Who do you have? Voltaire writing an inflammatory play against, Prophet Muhammad. And, in the cartoons specifically, Muslims and Jews in the Christian West, whatever that means, were seen as animals, dark blue, purple, beastly. 20th century, one of the most influential modes of communication was the camera, the image, the film. 1920s, silent movies, Rudolph Valentino's The Sheikh, right? You saw this cornucopia of Arab stereotypes, harems, and misogyny. And you fast forward and look, you said foreign policy. What's happening in the 70s? You had the rise of OPEC. You have Saudi Arabia flexing its muscles. You have Palestinian-Israeli conflict. 1979, what happens? Islamic Revolution. Who's the number one villain in wrestling? You might remember this.
The Iron Sheikh.
Iron Sheikh with his signature move, the camel clutch. In the 80s, I grew up with, I was rooting for Chuck Norris to kill all these brown people. I'm like, yeah, kill him. And then I got older, I'm like, this is really racist. Aladdin, Robin Williams as the genie, I don't know if you remember, 1992. Racist lyrics, where, hey, they cut off your face, they cut off your nose if they don't like your face, it's barbaric. But hey, at least it's home. And we're sitting there in the theater laughing. And it's this image of the convenient villain that is married to the foreign policy of the day. You also saw it with the Russians. And the Russians are making a comeback now in the 21st century. But it was the very convenient Arab Middle Eastern villain that, as we mentioned, after 9/11, has, if you will, morphed or evolved into Islam as the threat.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes before our break, but talk a little bit about that sort of feedback loop. I mean, to what extent do those images in the media make the receptivity for Islamophobia that much easier, and then seeing that that's the prevailing attitude, make it easier for the media to project those images?
You see, I'm part of the media, right? So the media is not just this boogeyman sitting in the corner saying, yes, excellent, we're going to go after the Muslims. The media, it's a neutral entity. If it bleeds, it leads. Sensationalism runs the day. And there's been a lot of bloodletting, unfortunately, in Muslim-majority countries. Both sides, they're being bombed, and also internally there's been a lot of chaos. So these are sexy stories. And media, and specifically culture, informs our perceptions of the other, perceptions of ourselves. It frames narratives, it frames history. And specifically when we've seen the research when it comes to Islamophobia, like I mentioned, the two core reasons, if you have to boil it down to, is most Americans don't know anything about Islam and Muslims. What they do know, is based on media misperceptions, and that is of the violent stereotype. Specifically, there is a mainstream media name of the famous caricature of the Muslim. It's called Rage Boy. Not making this up. Rage Boy has a beard, is angry, is burning the effigy of, the flag or the president of the day. He looks like this. He's on the cover of Newsweek. Rage Boy represents the anger, the rage, the belligerence of this Muslim horde. We don't know why they're angry. They're just, intrinsically angry against us and freedoms. And that really has dominated the mindset, I think, of a lot of Americans who don't know any better. And thus, going back to your first point, politicians are always able to play on these convenient stereotypes and boogeymans. And they say, listen, I'm tough on crime. I'm tough on national security. I'm going to go after these people who are threatening you and your children. I am better than the other guy, so vote for me. It happened with the Japanese Americans, World War II. They got interned, innocent. It's happening against Mexican immigrants who are apparently racists, rapists, and criminals, according to Donald Trump. It's always conveniently used against the African American male. And right now, for the past 4 years, and not just 2014, 2015, but also 2012, it's the Muslim.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that sort of unfortunate pedigree of various profiling and phobias in our political process. But first, we're going to take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about Islamophobia with Wajahat Ali. So, Before the break, we were talking a little bit about how this is not the first iteration of this kind of speech. And I think we've got another slide from 1942 you could take a look at. This is by none other than Theodore Geisel, or Dr. Seuss, in which we see Asian-looking people streaming out of Washington, Oregon, and California to collect their explosives from the fifth column. And
yes. At least they're smiling, though.
They are smiling. They're happy with their work.
This was the prerequisite before Cat in the Hat, I think.
Right. And if we go to the next slide, this is a novelty item from about that time.
Wow.
A hunting license for Japanese Americans. Now, lest we think we have evolved as a people.
Oh, nice. I'm honored.
From a current anti-Muslim website, the hunting permit for Muslims.
Not just the United States, but also Canada. So we're making, we're building a coalition here of North Americans. I like it.
So, talk a little about that trajectory. I mean, what is it in the nature of our body politic that seems to need some sort of people to scapegoat like that?
There's a famous quote by a journalist: "We'd rather feel safe than be free," right? And this feeling of safety, even if it's illusory and even if it's fantastical, it gives us a sense of calm. And that thing, we'd rather feel safe than be free, meaning we'll voluntarily, repeatedly, as a citizenry, give up our civil liberties, or rather, give up the civil liberties of those who are most marginalized for the feeling of safety, right? So we're fine with mosque protests. Even though there were no mosque protests when I was growing up, but there were 50 nationwide protests against mosques in the past 4 years. Even though, they're constitutionally protected houses of worship that have been here for 30, 40, 50 years, because it makes us feel safe, because we've heard this meme that they're Trojan horses, a fifth column, they're breeding this radical element. We're perfectly fine with Muslim citizens not being lawmakers or not being elected to the highest land of the office, even though they're fellow citizens, because, we don't know their real agenda, right? So we're willing to forfeit the Constitution. And I think it's a human condition. You outsource legitimate problems, if you will. You outsource legitimate grievances, and instead of actually taking ownership of it, and instead of actually blaming the real culprits or the real, root causes of income inequality, of a broken immigration system, of a broken criminal justice system, you just pivot. Say, oh, you need a bad guy? Tag, you're it. Mexican immigrant. Tag, you're it. African American male. Tag, you're it. The conniving Jew. Tag, you're it. The fifth column Irish Catholic. Tag, you're it, the Muslim American. And the first part of this conversation, we talked about the macro level, but I want to be very clear that anti-Muslim bigotry in the past 10 years specifically, Doug, has been manufactured by a small interconnected group of what I call lawmakers, media personnel, and think tanks, and also funded by some funders. I call it part of the Islamophobia Network. I did 6 months worth of research for the Center for American Progress, and we kind of mapped it out. It was called Fear Incorporated, the Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America, about how a small coterie of incestuous, like-minded people who have severe anti-Muslim bigotry, not only just anti-Muslim bigotry, but a record of anti-immigrant and anti-black bigotry, have come together to mainstream talking points against Muslims that were considered fringe pre-9/11. I'll give you an example. President Obama is a Muslim. Who's heard of that one? A practicing Muslim cannot be a loyal American. Mosques are not constitutionally protected houses of worship, but Trojan horses that are housing radical Islam. The radical Muslim Brotherhood has infiltrated America. Had you said this in 2005, people would have laughed at you. After the midterm elections of 2010, mainstream politicians have taken those talking points, I'm literally saying verbatim talking points, that have come out of right-wing extremist hate group think tanks, people like Bobby Jindal. That is a talking point that he's gotten from Steve Emerson, part of the Islamophobia Network, who said that there's a fifth column, Sharia enclaves in America and Europe. Steve Emerson said that about Birmingham. Dave Cameron laughed at him, right? So here we have Bobby Jindal, governor of Louisiana. He says, didn't work in Birmingham. 2 weeks later, I'm going to use it as a talking point. What happens? Appeals to his base. And Bobby Jindal knows better. So you see think tanks manufacturing the talking points. You see him handing it down to grassroots groups who give it to local officials. You see mainstream media with the blogosphere, with radio, some news channels, some websites. And then you see those exact talking points end up in the mouths of Ben Carson, the Sharia one, Bobby Jindal, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum. And in 2012, nearly every Republican presidential candidate, except Mitt Romney, ran with the anti-Sharia meme. They got votes off it, they got money off it, but at what cost? It made their neighbors who were Muslimi seen as suspects, and we've seen in the past 10 years, anti-Muslim hate crimes have risen by almost times 5, and anti-Muslim hate groups have risen by 30%. It's very scary.
So, what is the response on the part of the Muslim community? I mean, part of it is a lack of people who wrote their own narrative, isn't it?
I completely agree. Look, I'm an American Muslim, and I call my people out. I say, there was a study after 9/11 that said that about 90% of American Muslims were one of 4 occupations, right? Doctor, engineer, business, and the taxi service, right? Drivers. That leaves about 10% for who? Journalists, storytellers, politicians, therapists, local politicians, educators, and so forth. So if you're not writing your own story, your story is always written for you by others. And if you're not picking up the pen and emerging as the protagonist of your own narrative, you will emerge as the antagonist of now this global narrative being fueled by Islamophobes. So I always tell Muslims, you're going to sit there and whine and complain, drink water out of your cheesy cup, and yell at Bill O'Reilly and Fox News, or is she going to do something? And what I saw with my generation, I was a 21-year-old senior at UC Berkeley when the 2 towers fell. My generation was that one generation where we saw this moment of crisis and urgency, and it compelled us to pivot from the safe narrative of doctor and engineer business, and you saw stand-up comedians, graphic novelists, journalists, lawyers. We didn't even have any lawyers. And now you're seeing this generation of American Muslims emerge that is more proactive, more progressive, and they're saying we're going to engage because we see no conflict between our Muslim and American identity, and who are you, hater, to take away the American dream from me? But I do blame American Muslims also. If you're not willing to invest in the American narrative, if you're not willing to invest in the cultural roots, like literally go down and be not just a spectator but a participant, then this is going to keep happening.
Well, we've talked a fair amount about sort of earlier instances of sort of ethnically based phobias and discrimination and all that, which have, to a large extent, dissipated. I mean, you don't see horrendous anti-Japanese propaganda these days. So what was that process? How did the mainstream media come to sort of rehabilitate Japanese Americans?
Many Asian Americans say they're still marginalized. They got marginalized as the model minority, right? So they're kind of hidden. So all the problems are hidden, and you aspire to this model minority myth, and you're also loathed and hated by some part of America that blames you for their child not getting into college, right? So, but at the same time, it's not the vicious stereotype that's going to come and kill you, the 5th column, right? They're going to come and take your kid's seat at Stanford. Look, it's a process. You have to engage politics, you have to engage academia, you have to engage the local grassroots, and you have to engage media. It takes a coalition of the willing. Each member of the community in their respective fields with their respective talents has to be proactive and say their narrative and emerge as the best version of themselves and work with other groups, a multicultural coalition of the willing, intersection of, race and ethnicity. I say even LGBT communities, religion, to say, you know what? If you poison the pluralistic well of America, it not just hurts my community, but if we keep expanding and stretching the American narrative and keep pushing for freedoms, it's better for your kid and my kid. So now you're seeing in 2015, LGBT members who never used to talk to Muslim community members, uniting over shared values, saying, hey, if there is, anti-gay bigotry, it's actually, we should unite because anti-Muslim bigotry affects my community as well. So let's work together in tandem against the haters. And what we've seen, I think this is positive, in the past 15 years is, in 2002, it'd be rare to see an eloquent, dark-skinned Muslim on television. You had a token. But now you have a smattering, right? You see Muslim journalists. You see Muslim politicians, Keith Ellison, Andre Carson. That didn't happen before. We have 2 of 435. We're going to take over. You have a Muslim president, Barack Hussein Obama. I'm kidding, America. But, you're seeing the remake, if you will, of what Catholics, Jews, and LGBT members did to ensure that they're no longer marginalized, that they also have a seat at the table, and they become part of the mainstream. The way to do that is to participate, and you have a collection of talents from your community. Not everyone can be a doctor. Not everyone can be a businessman. You need someone to emerge as a politician, as a lawyer, as an educator, as a storyteller, and you have to work with other Americans because that's the only way this rough draft is going to keep evolving.
So, we've got just about a minute left. If you can get on your soapbox and offer both the American Muslim community and people with Muslim neighbors a quick word of advice. What might
have hope. I always say have hope. You can sit here and listen to this conversation and punch yourself in the face and feel despair, but this is a remake. This has happened before. The boogeyman right now happens to be Muslims, but in the past it was Irish Catholics, Jews, LGBT community. And it's up to American Muslims to emerge as the best versions of themselves with their American and Islamic values. You help your own community, but once you make the mainstream, you have to look back and help that person who's struggling, reach out your hand across the aisle, and you'll find someone with a good heart and good intentions who might just be ignorant, not know any better, who's willing to grab your hand and move forward. And that's what we have to do.
Very good. Well, we'll leave it at that. Wajahat Ali.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,